In our last discussions, we have been looking into the phenomenon of social change and how to understand or explain them. Out of those attempts were born a number of theories of social change, of which we have made two broad categories: linear theories and cyclical theories. On the last occasion, we have been dealing with linear theories, particularly the ideas of Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, and L.T. Hobhouse. We have deliberately left out of that discussion Marx's theory of social change, which can and which does very well qualify to be a linear theory of social change. Marx's ideas on social change do deserve a special or a separate discussion because it is distinct from all other linear theories, or for that matter all other theories of social change. Why? Just a small quotation from one of the numerous writings of Karl Marx would suffice to show why we are treating Marx in a different manner and giving Marxist ideas a different slot for discussion. Marx wrote, I quote, "The philosophers so far have interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Unquote. Now, if we look carefully into this sentence, you can very easily get the idea why Marxism deserves a special or a distinct place in our discussion. All other theories of social change have tried to narrate, describe, explain, and interpret the process of social change as each individual thinker found it. Marx was giving more stress, a stress more than mere interpretation, a stress on changing the society. To repeat, the point, however, is to change it. So, Marxism as a body of thought, Marxism as a theory, Marxism as a philosophy was not content just to interpret the process of change. It was calling for deliberate human intervention in the process of social change. That significantly distinguishes Marxist theory of social change from all other such theories. Marx, to come down to the reality, to come down to the grassroots, was living and writing in the middle of the 19th century, a time during which Europe was going through massive transformations of social, economic, and political nature. There were reasons for that. There have been revolutions like French Revolution, a political revolution in which monarchy was dislodged from power and some kind of rudimentary republic came into power. In the middle of the 18th century, 30s and 40s, there came about Industrial Revolution, which almost fundamentally altered the nature not only of European economy, but its politics and society as well. Marx was witnessing all these transformations before his eyes, and he tried to interpret the process of change, not in a very ad hoc fashion, not just interpreting the change which he did find happening before his eyes, but delving deep back into the history and looking ahead into the future and using a particular theoretical framework which goes by the name of materialist interpretation of history, or in a short manner, historical materialism. Now, what in fact is historical materialism? Because without understanding historical materialism, which, as I told, is a short form of materialist interpretation of history. In fact, Marx never used the term historical materialism. He always insisted on using materialist interpretation of history. Now, once again, I would quote from Marx, to understand the materialist interpretation of history, without which no one can understand the process of social change according to Marxist ideas. I quote, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely, relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society." Unquote, for the time being. This economic structure of society, Marx has labeled it as the economic base, or the base of the society, and out of which is born the base superstructure theory, a part of the materialist interpretation of history. I quote again, "The real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness." Unquote. Now, if we try to understand what Marx meant by it, Marx is looking at society as if it's some kind of a structure. It has a base, and on the base rises a superstructure. The base was entirely economic, composed of relations of production and forces of production. And on this base, economic in character, was built up the superstructure of society, the social superstructure, which included politics, culture, religion, social practices, and everything other than economy. Just as in case of a building, just as in case of an architectural construction, the base comes first and the superstructure comes second. Just as in case of that kind of civil construction, the base, the nature of the base, the strength of the base is very important for the entire superstructure which stands on it. And just as if we can manage to harm the base, if the base is harmed in some way or other, if the base is weakened in some way or other, the entire superstructure stands on a risky ground. On that metaphor, Marx was looking at society. As the economic base was composed of a number of factors. The way men produce things, the components with which they produce things, their labor, their experience, their skill, the machineries, primitive or modern, sources of power, and most importantly, the relations into which they entered into one another while producing the goods necessary for society. So, the base was composed both of material factors as well as non-material interpersonal relations. And these material factors, the way the men produced, the elements with which they produce something, their knowledge base, their skill, their experience, we know changes with time. Human history, and without being a Marxist, one can always understand that, human history has followed a course in which men have tried more and more to come into control over nature. At the very beginning of the journey, human beings were totally at the mercy of nature and natural forces. And nature became some kind of force they had to contend with. And the entire journey of human civilization is composed of, or is built around, man's incessant attempts to control nature, to control natural forces for the benefit of mankind. For reasons of existence, for reasons for improvement in the conditions of existence, men have been inventing things, discovering things, putting their intelligence to use, putting their experience to use, and so on and so forth, they are progressing. Now what happens? I talked about, when I was talking about the economic base, I talked about the material side and the non-material side. On the material side, which is known as the means of production in Marxist terminology, the forces of production, man's labor power, man's skill, experience, and so on. And on the non-material side, there are the relations men entered unwillingly, unknowingly, but they had to enter with each other, relations with each other, while they are in the process of social production. Now, at a particular point of time, there comes a disjunction between the improvement in the mode of production, in the forces of production, in the material side of production, and the non-material production relations. So long as there is a synergy between the two, production continues and society continues to progress. When you find that the improvement in means of or forces of production cannot fully be realized, the fruits cannot fully be realized because the relations stand in the way, there comes the time of conflict. And out of that conflict between new forces of production and old relations of production, there comes a transformation, a social transformation. In the post-Renaissance period in 13th, 14th, or 15th centuries, with the discovery of many faraway lands, there came about a further change, a better opportunity for increasing production. People came to know how to produce more. Improved means of irrigation, some kind of improved means of fertilizer, much greater market demand for more and more production, lands not being put to use so long were brought under the enclosure movement, they are put to cultivation uses of cultivation. So there is a huge potential for changes in production, changes in cultivation. And alongside came, which is known as Industrial Revolution of 1730s. the major objective of Industrial Revolution was to replace as much as possible human labor with machine labor, because human labor has a limit. A human being can give his labor only for a particular point of time. There is an original motivation behind Industrial Revolution. Now, its impact started spreading across the society. Factories started coming up, industries started coming up, and industries required labor, required workers. But where were the workers? Workers have to be found within the society itself. And the largest number of the working population was concentrated in the agricultural sector and hardly being used. Now, that slumbering workforce had to be wakened up, had to be brought out of the unused labor market to be put to use. And at the same time, there's much more increased or much more improved means of production. And at that point of time, there came about a change which is known as the bourgeois revolution or the bourgeois transformation of society, in which the landowner-peasant relationship was abolished. Feudalism as a system of society which permitted this relationship was abolished, and in its place came a new form of society known as a capitalist form of society. The sleeping labor force was put to use. There's a huge migration from the countryside to the urban areas. Put these migrating workers who have left agriculture and come to the cities in search of jobs, they are put as workers in the newly coming up industries. So the problem of labor was solved. Machines have been introduced, and machines are always being improved every day. So once again, there is a conflict between old forces of production and new forces of production, and the old relations of production. Now, to go back to Marxist writing once again. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. That's in a nutshell the way Marx explained the process of social change. Now, if we stop at this point, it might so appear that as if this entire process is happening without any human intervention. As if you can just sit back and watch, just can sit back and enjoy the benefits of this social change. It will happen automatically. And that would be a very much wrong idea of Marxism, because I have started with a quotation which gave a total emphasis on changing society, changing through deliberate human intervention. So who are these people who are these people who, or with, through whose conflict, through whose intervention the society changes? Allow me to go to Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, a joint production of Karl Marx and his lifelong friend and comrade Friedrich Engels. The chapter 1 of Communist Manifesto starts with the oft-heard, oft-read sentence, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." The second sentence, I quote, "Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." This is where human beings come in. The process of transformation does not take place automatically. It can happen only through a process called class conflict. Now, when Marx and Engels write, freeman and slave, they are two contending classes. Patrician and plebeian, two contending classes. Lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, and in a word, oppression and oppressed. Now, these two contending classes deliberately get into a conflicting mode. They stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted fight. The fight sometimes hidden, sometimes open, and the fight ended either in a revolutionary, radical reconstruction of the society at large, that is, social change, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Usually, what happened was there was a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large. So, human intervention, deliberate human action through their participation in class conflict was the subjective element. The improvement of forces of production was the objective element. In Marxian terminology, the objective factor and the subjective factor. And the objective factor and the subjective factor link themselves up. They are the same plane. Objective factors backed up by subjective factors. There comes about that fundamental social transformation which goes by the name of social change. That is how Marx described the process of social change on the basis of his ideas known as a materialist interpretation of history. On the basis of this kind of change, Marx distinguished some different stages of society, starting from primitive communism, then slave society, then feudal society, then capitalist society, and then socialist society. At each stage, from slave to feudal, from feudal to capitalist, from capitalist to socialist society, there are fundamental social transformations which we can describe as social change. Transformations which took place not just because society developed materially, men learned to produce in a different or better manner, men learned to use machines, but at the same time, men were divided on the basis of property into two contending classes. And these contending classes get into a conflictual mode. It's known as class conflict. And the resolution of this class conflict brings about social change. So, that's in a nutshell the Marxist idea of social change. It has been duly criticized, of course, and Marx met with more criticism than perhaps any other thinker. I am not going into the reasons behind that. That definitely needs a separate kind of discussion. But the major criticism against this Marxist idea of social change was that it's too much insistence on economic change in economy, which many have interpreted as some kind of economic determinism. They would like to point out, and they have pointed out, that there are important areas in society, in its politics, in its culture, where changes come about and which also contribute to the total process of social change. That definitely is reality, and Marx was not unaware of it. When he was telling us, or he was explaining his base superstructure theory, that base determines the superstructure, change in the base brings about a corresponding change in superstructure, he is also aware of the fact that there can be changes in superstructure which in turn would bring about changes in base. But the basis was the economic foundation. The most important was change in the economy, which brought about a total social change.